Um, this morning I want to look at where we are now and where we go from here. And I was thinking the other day about how do you characterize welfare reform, and I mean welfare reform in its entirety. And I came up with the analogy of, imagine you've a landlord, and you're the tenant, you're being shown into this property, you're whisked into the hall and straight into a living room. And there is the living room, is this newly refurbished carpet, very nice three-piece suite, lovely new television, it's all been redecorated, looks great. And then you start to have a look and you actually start to lift the carpet and it doesn't look quite as good as it does on the surface. But before you can do anything else, you then say, well, I want to look at the rest of the house, please. So you then go into the kitchen, and the landlord starts to look a bit more downcast because there's no cooker, there's no fridge. The sink looks like it hasn't been touched for many years. You then go into the hall, and you suddenly notice that the what looked like new carpet actually stops at the first step on the landing. So you go up on the bare steps and into the bedrooms. And the bedrooms have no carpet either. And we're not talking Swedish floorboards and trendy design here. And there's no bed, there's no curtains. In fact, there's no bedroom furniture at all. And when you start to ask, well, but don't worry about that. We had to sell all of that in order to put the carpet down in the living room and everything else. So you hold your skepticism for a second, come back and have a look at that lovely living room again. So you go back down into the living room and you suddenly notice what you had missed at the start. There's a state-of-the-art computer in the living room. Great. I'm into IT. Well, maybe I can imagine it. So you try and turn the computer on, and unfortunately it doesn't work. And you actually look behind the computer. It is a state-of-the-art screen, but actually there's nothing behind the computer, which explains why it doesn't work. And that, to me, is a bit like, I'm afraid, welfare reform. It's a slightly unfair characterization, but it's not far off the mark. In effect, what we've done with welfare reform, and I'm being cautious of this, is for every pound, effectively, that's been spent on, and going to be spent on universal credit, and the ancillary reforms around universal credit, in terms of what we might do with passport benefits, what we might do with the son or daughter of social fund, etc. We've paid for that by taking at least a fiver out for every pound that's been spent. And I think, as I say, the fiver is probably a cautious analogy. So it was interesting when Marie talked about, the 750 million. Well, if you put in, and it's very hard to know exactly how much we'll spend on universal credit more, because it'll depend on how people respond to universal credit and the earnings disregard, and much more importantly, it'll depend on what the economy does. But we can be pretty confident it's not going to be much more than 150 million at most. So we are taking a great deal out of the economy, and we're putting a relatively small amount back. So where are we in Britain, and then where are we in Northern Ireland, and more importantly, where do we go from here? Well, in Britain, the Welfare Reform Act was passed in March 2012, and the first changes were implemented actually on the 30th of April 2012. So they're pretty much, in fact, last week, 18 months old. And the first change was to take away and confine employment and support allowance contributory for 12 months. And if you remember, that was a retrospective payment. So if you'd been on contributory ESA for 12 months, you then lost the benefit if you were in the work-related activity group. So that was the first change and the first saving that was made. And we've already, 18 months have passed, and we don't have our bill implementing something similar. However, pretty much everything else has tended to slow down in the Welfare Reform Bill. So universal credit, for example, the original timetable was a national rollout. In fact, a national rollout this week. In fact, what we've had instead is in April 2013, we started in one area in Britain, in Warrington. In July, it was extended to 3 other Pathfinder areas, all done with only the most simplest of claims possible. And then now, what was to be a national rollout is now 6 areas of Britain. So at least one place in Scotland and Wales, and 4 Job Centre Plus offices and areas in England. Now, why has that ambition been tempered? Well, a number of reasons. The most clear-cut one is the IT. If any of you, I'm sad enough to read these reports, read the National Audit Office report in August, it was absolutely devastating about the IT. And what I liked about the report was it was incredibly measured in its language, it was incredibly sober, it was almost understated. And the understatement actually just made it all the more powerful about just how badly things were progressing, or perhaps more importantly, not progressing with IT. So the new mantra amongst ministers and amongst senior officials in DWP in Britain is that not the IT isn't working, it is we must get this right, we're really keen to make sure that it all works properly, therefore we're going slowly and steadily and surely, all of which sounds like eminently sensible, frankly, on the one hand, but is an enormous change from the rhetoric that was around barely 2 years ago. And we are moving slowly and surely in universal credit, but interestingly, we're going to be moving slowly and surely where universal credit now rolls out at the time of a general election. So there is a lot to play for, and you only have to listen to the party conferences in the last 3 weeks to see how important welfare reform and the different approaches to welfare reform are to the political parties in Britain. PIP, personal independence payment, is also slowing down. Nothing to do with IT, but I think more to do with the enormity of the change, and a much more sensible timetable has been introduced both in Britain and in Northern Ireland, assuming we get our bill. But overall, the results for PIP and the introduction will be devastating in Northern Ireland. We, per head of population, about double the proportion of Northern Ireland claimants claim disability living allowance at the moment than in Britain. That's for a variety of factors. We have much greater mental health. We have a very vibrant advice sector. We've come out of 40 years of troubles, of political strife. There are a whole variety of reasons as to why disability living allowance is more predominant in Northern Ireland. We're going to lose 25% of our claimants during the transition from DLA to PIP. That's the estimate that the DSD have suggested. And we have to remember, if you lose PIP, if you move that transition from DLA to PIP, the chances are someone else is going to lose a carer's allowance, and in universal credit, you will lose additional payments that go with having a disability. Not everybody will lose them, you may be on other benefits, but a significant number of people will. So it's not just about losing a single benefit, it's losing a great deal more besides. And one of the virtues being sold of universal credit is you won't be worse off at the point of change. So when you move into universal credit, you'll carry on getting the money you get now. By the time we get to most people being looked at in transition from DLA to PIP, well, if you've got that protection, it'll go if you lose your PIP. So a significant number of people with disabilities are going to find a devastating hole in the amount of money that they have, and the carer of that person will find a hole in his or her income as well. And the other thing about PIP, to say quickly, and I think this has probably not been picked up anywhere as far as I can see significantly yet, and that is a lot of people on PIP will either see an increase in income, some people will end up, as a result of the migration, better off, and some will end up worse off, but still on the benefit. In Britain, that pretty much balances out. They expect about 29% of the population to end up with a higher rate of benefit under PIP than DLA, and about 29% will end up on a lower rate of benefit. So gainers and losers will be pretty much in sync in terms of the percentage of claimants. In Northern Ireland, about 24%, 5 percentage points lower, will probably gain an additional benefit. 32% will find themselves on a lower rate of benefit. So unlike that balancing 29-29, it's 24 and 32 in Northern Ireland. So when you add that to 25% of people coming off the benefit, that's going to make a devastating impact on households with people with disabilities. Elsewhere, we've started one or two now of the new reforms. The benefit cap is in. It came in a little more slowly. The bedroom tax or the spare room subsidy, or as I was thinking about this the other day, what really should we call this? Well, as you know, in the voluntary sector, we've been told outcomes is the important thing. We're not interested in outputs anymore, it's outcomes. Well, let's call it on an outcomes basis. It's actually the increased rent arrears scheme and increased hardship scheme, because as far as I can see, that's the outcome, so we may as well refer to it in an outcome-based model as we're told to do. We're already seeing the devastating impact of it in terms of rent arrears in Britain. The reports by the National Federation of Housing Associations in England, the Scottish Housing Federation of Housing Associations have both produced reports saying it's already having a really big impact. So, the other thing to remember in all of this is that a number of the reforms have happened already and are going to happen whether we get a bill or not. The uprating of Social Security benefits by less than inflation and freezing of some benefits, that doesn't need a welfare reform bill to happen. It's happened already. A number of the housing benefit cuts have happened already, to the local housing allowance, to the rent reference moving from being under 25 to under 35. Young people used to be under 25, now they're under 35. If it keeps going in that way, I'll become a young person again at some stage, but there we are. So, where is our bill and where do we go? And let me quickly then run through 7 things that I think we need to do. First, we have to start with the realpolitik of this, and I make no apologies for saying this. We're going to get a welfare reform bill, whether we like it or not. And much of it will look like Britain's bill. And the reason I say that is the IT system, imperfect or otherwise, that drives our current social security system operates from Britain. The new IT system from Universal Credit operates as well from Britain. It's clear to me that neither the politicians or senior officials have any appetite for the cost, the resources, the risk that it would take to run our own social security system. It's not going to happen, and the old system's got to be turned off at some stage. Secondly, and I have to say, I am not misty-eyed for the current social security system. I don't have much nostalgia for remembering that in 1988, the earnings disregard for single people was £5, and it hasn't gone up in 25 years. So this system needs fixing. So to have what we hold is not really that credible a solution. However, there's a great deal that we can do. So let's look at of what that is. The first thing, and I really welcome today that the research that NICVA's commissioned, we have to hammering home the point that this is an economic issue as well as a social issue. This isn't just about what a compassionate society we should be and about humanitarianism. It is about those things. It's about what's coming out of the local economy. If you take £750 million out of the local economy, you're taking it out of the most deprived areas. The report says that very clearly. Well, if you take that out, it goes counterintuitive to a lot of the things that the programme for government in Northern Ireland, that the Northern Ireland Executive wants to do. It wants to promote and tackle poverty through local economic imperatives alongside other things. Well, how do you do that if you take large amounts out of the local economy? And politicians, it's the economy stupid, as they say in politics and in elections. So we need to keep the focus on the economy. Second, there have been some flexibilities to date, but we mustn't be complacent about them. So the fact that you can more readily claim fortnightly rather than monthly universal credit, the commitment to pay to landlords, and the larger proportion of splitting payments, a great deal's been made of that. They're all actually very welcome and very sensible, but we haven't seen the detail. And frankly, there are 2 approaches here. It's either a meaningful flexibility or it's a minimalist one. And I'm not sure we know the answer to that yet, so don't take for granted what we've already been able to achieve. We really need to make sure that that detail is nailed down. And I think there's a battle going on in the department about whether we go for the meaningful or the minimalist approach. So that's a really important issue to keep a focus on. We need to look at other kinds of flexibilities, if you want to use concessions, whatever the right word you choose to use. The kind of things that are really important are, and this is not an exclusive list, greater propensity to recover over payments, forcing European Union nationals and other migrants into the all-work requirements category, regardless of their circumstances, regardless if they have a child under 12 months or they're carers or like any other, frankly, citizen in Northern Ireland. Ramping up sanctions, making both partners sign up to a claimant commitment. So if the woman is prepared to sign it up and the man isn't, none of them get benefit. Makes no sense at all. Those are issues that we need to look at, and there are many more besides. And again, in terms of the realpolitik of this, and I don't want to hide any of this, there's a price tag for all of this. The letter was Sammy Wilson's pocket. No doubt he's handed it to Nigel Hamilton, from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, from Danny Alexander. Simon Hamilton, sorry. Sorry, yeah. Thanks, from Simon Hamilton, yeah. So I'm just rewriting history as I go along. Some people have said I've spent a career doing that. That letter says that from January 2014, there will be a price tag attached to the delay. And the price tag is 5 million a month. Now, whether it will turn into 5 million a month or not, that's the current state of play. The Treasury are saying the price tag is eventually going to happen. So we need to be aware of that. But in terms of some of the extra costs of some of these proposals, some of them actually have very little extra cost. Others actually save money elsewhere, and you can make a very credible argument that actually the kind of money you're going to have to find in the displacement costs make it economic sense, and I'll come back to that on bedroom tax. The other thing to remember is there are already some concessions in the pipeline, and anybody heard Good Morning Ulster this morning and heard Nelson doing his best to try not to tell you what they were? Well, I'll tell you what one of them currently is. If you read Inside Housing, and it's probably not the bestseller, it's probably not one that you immediately grab, but in August, Alex Maskey said very clearly, and Alex Maskey is a very media-savvy individual. He doesn't speak off the cuff to the media, and he said very clearly that the bedroom tax will not be introduced for existing claimants in Northern Ireland, and you can bet your bottom dollar that's what's being looked at the moment. So we're 2/3 of the way to probably the money that's saved. It's a short step, frankly, from there to going to where the UN Rapporteur for Housing suggested we go, which is get rid of it altogether. So that's a very significant concession. It makes immense sense, and it's testimony to the organisations in this room and many others for the work that they've done through the Welfare Reform Group and through your individual work. So that's where things are. Now, as ever, you're going to have to find the fine detail, but what else there's being discussed at the moment, I don't know. The discussions seem to be almost hermetically sealed between the two parties, and I don't think they've yet started to talk to the other parties around the table in the executive. So the timetable is shifting as we speak. Very quickly then, 2 or 3 other things. Parity. Some of these proposals are with Dell. The proposals that came up this week were all ones that would go to Dell. The idea that, frankly, after 2 years, it's a job creation scheme for Dell, that you have to sign on every day, actually that's going to cost more money. So there's no financial cost to deciding not to do it. Dell are not hung up by parity. There's no reason why we have to do that. The 6th thing is a lot of stuff in universal credit is still to be worked through. The earnings disregard is more generous. It's more sensible. It encourages people into work. But it could be undermined depending on what we do with passport benefits and rate rebates in Northern Ireland. So, and what happens with our son or daughter of social fund, etc. There are problems with universal credit that you don't need to be a soothsayer to predict. The self-employed are treated much worse under universal credit than they are under the existing system. Well, if the economy is poor, then you tend to move people into self-employment. This government wants to encourage people, both in Britain and here, into self-employment. Universal credit does not help people effectively into self-employment. So there will be problems with universal credit as it unfurls. And then finally, how do we actually deliver social security? And this is, again, something that we can do locally, both digitally and non-digitally. It's about customer service. It's about how the Social Security Agency and Dell deliver it. And there are some important and good examples of very practical and good work that's been done by the SSA. In customer service terms, you're less likely to find yourself off ESA than you are in Britain, which is a sort of interesting, it's not by very much, but a significant percentage terms. And the voluntary sector support, because at the end of the day, large numbers of people will be coming to the voluntary sector. So we can look at how we support advice services on the ground and regionally. But finally, and this is really important for me, and it's a challenge to every single person in this room, we have to reject the strivers and shirkers language of George Osborne and the Conservative Party in particular. And let me say very clearly, people are not deserving or undeserving. People are people with their individual circumstances that have led them into unemployment or having to care for someone, or because of their disability they can't find work. Everybody has an individual story. This is about social security, and we need to reclaim social security. It's not about welfare dependency or welfare benefits. Free education is not a welfare benefit. Going to your local hospital when you're in an emergency is not a welfare benefit, and neither is social security. So we need to win that, and that's a tough task out there, but I think there's an enormous amount to play for. We can mobilize people to embolden our politicians to show local accountability and make a real difference with this campaign. It's a campaign we can actually win. So thank you very much.
Stay with us. Let's take a couple of questions from you, a couple of comments from the floor to Les on this. George Osborne, Ian Duncan-Smith are not here this morning, but I suspect if they were, they would say to you,
Yep.
So let's just put this point to you.
Yep.
Do you acknowledge that there is a problem of welfare dependency? Do you acknowledge that there is a problem of some people under 25, for example, who are not in work, not in training, not in apprenticeships and skills training?
I would reframe it. There's not a problem of welfare dependency, but if you were asking me the question is, would it be better to get people into work than on Social Security if you're young, single, and in a reasonable health, and there are jobs out there? My answer, as almost everybody I suspect in this room would say, yes to that. Now, the ingredients for that to happen is there needs to be the work there for people to get into. Mm-hmm. There needs to be positive incentives to encourage people into work. So signing on every day after you've been unemployed for 2 years is not going to make a jot of difference to anybody getting back into employment. So the issue here is about how do we create a system that recognizes and encourages people into work in a way that's not punitive, that doesn't stigmatize, that actually allows people to move into work in the first place.
And what about the claim from George Osborne and from Ian Duncan-Smith that actually changes the ritual of someone's day, gets them out of bed, gets them focused, they want to get out of that job centre, so it might actually give them a bit of motivation?
Well, I tell you, I listened to George Osborne's speech, and what I was struck by was that you'd have almost thought, if you'd heard George Osborne, that for the first 2 years that you're unemployed, whether in Britain or in Northern Ireland, you spend most of it in a hammock in a back garden somewhere, and then suddenly after 2 years you have to get out of this hammock that you've had, or the sunbed or whatever it happens to be, and then suddenly start showing some initiative. Almost from day one now, you've got to actively seek work. After 3 months, you've got to engage very positively. Long before you've got through 2 years, you'll have been through several retraining courses. You will have had all sorts of initiatives applied onto you. So after 2 years, you've already been through pretty much the same system that they're about to put you through again after 2 years. So, let's not fall into the trap of of being on the dole is actually an easy thing to do. And the other thing.
Final question for me before our audience's caffeine starts triggering in. On the question really of the law, we've heard some comments from the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission about welfare reform, the bedroom tax, or the increased rent arrears scheme, as you call it. Do you think there could be some legal challenges, significant European-based, for example, legal challenges around welfare reform?
Yeah, yes, I do. And there's a couple of interesting technical questions for us. The short answer is yes. In Britain, there are already several. One failed, for example, about a challenge to the bedroom tax, but an earlier successful challenge that the government didn't meet properly. The judges said, go and actually make some further concessions to the bedroom tax. There are other challenges that are in the pipeline around benefit cap, etc. But no challenges about, for example, how we're going to treat EU migrants. I think that's an area, saying to an EU migrant, regardless of your circumstances, you've got to look for work 35 hours a week, even if you're a full-time carer or whatever, I think that's open to challenge. But our challenges, interestingly, most of them won't start in the courts, because our legislation is what's called secondary legislation for the purpose of the Human Rights Act. We can go to tribunals and commissioners, and I suspect that means we can probably push some challenges through more quickly than you might do in Britain, where you've got to get legal aid or find somebody to fund a challenge by way of judicial review. So if we ever get the bill, or when we get the bill, we've got some scope to move things perhaps more quickly than they might in Britain.
Let's thank Les Allamby. Thank you very much.
Thank you.